The cold October wind cut through downtown Cedar Falls like a knife, carrying with it the smell of rain and the promise of an even harsher night ahead. Maya pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, but it did little good. The worn fabric had long ago lost its ability to keep out the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She had been sitting on these stone steps for 4 days now. 4 long days and 3 endless nights, watching the world go by while she remained invisible to everyone who passed. The steps of St. Matthew's Church had become her temporary home, though calling it a home felt like a cruel joke. Home was supposed to be warm and safe. This was neither. Maya shifted slightly, trying to find a position that didn't make her back ache quite so much. The cardboard beneath her had turned soggy from the previous night's drizzle, and the newspapers she used as a blanket were falling apart. She tucked her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible, and watched the early morning commuters hurry past. A businessman in an expensive suit walked by, talking loudly into his phone about quarterly reports and profit margins. He didn't even glance in her direction. A jogger in bright athletic wear bounced past, earbuds blocking out the world around her. 3 college students laughed together as they headed toward the campus, their backpacks stuffed with books and their futures full of possibilities that Maya could barely remember having herself. 20-8 years old, and this is where life had brought her. If someone had told her a year ago that she would be sleeping on church steps, she would have laughed. Back then, she had a job at the local bookstore, a small apartment with plants on the windowsill and plans for the weekend. She had a life that made sense, even if it wasn't perfect, but life has a way of falling apart quickly when everything goes wrong at once. First, the bookstore closed when the owner couldn't compete with online retailers. Then came the eviction notice when she couldn't make rent. Her savings, never very large to begin with, disappeared faster than she thought possible. The friends she thought she could count on suddenly became busy, unavailable, full of excuses but short on actual help. The women's shelter had been her last hope, but it had been full for weeks. Every morning she joined the line of desperate women hoping. Someone had left, making space for someone new. Every afternoon she walked away disappointed, carrying her few possessions in a backpack that grew heavier with each passing day. Maya closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to wake up in a real bed, to have hot water for a shower, to open a refrigerator and choose what to eat. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who had taken those simple comforts for granted. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk made her open her eyes again. A mother was walking by with her young daughter, both dressed warmly against the morning chill. The little girl noticed Maya and started to point, but her mother quickly pulled her hand down and hurried past. Maya caught the woman's whispered words carried on the wind. "Don't stare, honey. Some people just make bad choices. Bad choices. If only it were that simple. If only poverty and homelessness came down to a series of poor decisions that could be easily avoided." Maya hadn't chosen to lose her job or her home. She hadn't chosen to have no family to turn to, no safety net to catch her when she fell. She had simply been unlucky in a world where a few missed paychecks could destroy everything you had worked for. She pulled out her phone, though the battery was nearly dead. No missed calls, no messages. The silence was deafening. There had been a time when her phone buzzed constantly with texts from friends, notifications from social media, reminders about appointments and plans. Now it served mainly as a way to check the time and the weather forecast that always seemed to promise more cold, more rain, more reasons to worry about the night ahead. The church bells chimed 8 o'clock, their deep bronze voices echoing off the surrounding buildings. Maya had grown to both love and hate that sound. It marked the passage of time in a life where the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, but it also reminded her that this was a place of supposed sanctuary that remained locked to people like her. She had tried the doors on her first night, hoping to find shelter inside the warm building. But churches, she discovered, were not the refuges she had imagined from childhood stories. They opened for services and meetings, then locked their doors against the very people who needed them most. The irony wasn't lost on her that she slept outside a building. Dedicated to helping others, a police car rolled slowly down the street and Maya tensed. She had learned to be wary of law enforcement since becoming homeless. Sometimes they moved her along with a warning. Other times they were kinder, offering information about shelters or food banks. You never knew which version you would get until they were standing in front of you, this time. The car kept moving and Maya allowed herself to relax slightly. She knew her time on these steps was limited. Eventually someone would complain, or the church officials would notice her presence and ask her to leave. Then she would have to find somewhere else to sleep, somewhere that might not be as relatively safe as these stone steps under the watchful eyes of stained glass saints. The morning grew busier as more people emerged for their daily routines. Maya watched them all, these fortunate souls with places to go and purposes that got them out of bed each morning. She wondered if any of them had ever been where she was now, or if they even understood how quickly a life could unravel, a delivery. Truck rumbled past, followed by a school bus full of children heading to their morning lessons. Life continued its normal rhythm all around her while she remained frozen in this terrible moment. This suspended existence between having a life and having nothing at all got her stomach cramped with hunger. She had found half a sandwich in a trash can yesterday, but that felt like a lifetime ago. The gnawing emptiness in her belly was becoming a constant companion, along with the cold and the fear and the crushing weight of uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. Maya looked up at the stained glass windows of the church, where colorful biblical scenes caught the morning light. She wasn't particularly religious, but she found herself hoping that someone, somewhere, was paying attention to her story. That someone cared about the woman on the steps who was trying so hard to hold on to hope when everything else had been stripped away. The wind picked up again, scattering dead leaves across the sidewalk and making Maya shiver despite her efforts to stay warm. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine a different ending to this story. One where warmth and kindness found their way to cold stone steps, where a woman sat waiting for her life to begin again. She had no way of knowing that across the street, a pickup truck had just pulled up to the feed store, and behind the wheel sat someone who was about to change everything. Someone who understood loneliness and loss, and who still believed in the power of simple human kindness to heal even the deepest wounds. For now, Maya simply sat and waited, unaware that her rescue was loading feed bags just 50 yards away, trying to decide whether to follow the pull in his chest that was telling him to walk across the street and offer help to a stranger who needed it more than she would ever know. Tom finished loading the last bag of cattle feed into the back of his pickup truck, wiping his hands on his jeans as he surveyed his weekly haul from the farm supply store. 50 pounds of grain, veterinary supplies, and enough fencing wire to repair the section that last week's storm had damaged. Same routine every Thursday morning for the past 10 years. Ever since he had taken over running the ranch full-time, he climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine rumbling to life with a familiar sound that always made him feel grounded. The radio crackled with a weather report promising more rain, which was both good and bad news. Good for the pastures that were still recovering from the summer drought. Bad for anyone without a roof over their head. As he pulled away from the curb, Tom glanced across the street toward St. Matthew's Church, a habit he had developed over the years. The old stone building reminded him of the church where he and Linda had gotten married 15 years ago. Back when life felt full of endless possibilities and shared dreams, that's when he saw her, a small figure huddled against the stone steps. So still she might have been part of the building itself. Tom slowed his truck, squinting through the windshield to get a better look. It was definitely a person, a young woman from what he could tell, wrapped in clothes that looked too thin for the October chill. He had driven this route every week for years, and he had never seen anyone sleeping on those church steps before. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut, bringing back memories he tried to keep buried. Memories of his own dark days after Linda's cancer diagnosis, when he had felt lost and alone, even surrounded by well-meaning friends and family. Tom pulled over to the side of the road and sat there with the engine idling, staring across the street at the woman who seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. She had her knees pulled up to her chest and her head down, the universal posture of someone who had given up hope of being seen as a person worth caring about. He knew that feeling. After Linda died, he had spent months feeling like a ghost in his own life, going through the motions while feeling completely disconnected from the world around him. The only difference was that he had a warm house to retreat to, a place where he could fall apart in private. This woman had nothing but stone steps and the charity of strangers. A businessman walked past her without even a glance, followed by a jogger who seemed determined not to notice anything beyond her own workout routine. Tom watched as 3 college students laughed their way past the church, their voices carrying across the quiet street. None of them saw her. Or maybe they saw her and chose to look away, which was somehow worse. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He thought about Linda and how she would have reacted to seeing someone in need. She never could walk past a stray dog without stopping to help, let alone a human being who was clearly struggling. There but for the grace of God, she used to say whenever they encountered someone down on their luck, but approaching a stranger, especially a woman who was vulnerable and probably scared, wasn't something to be taken lightly. Tom understood that his size and appearance might be intimidating. At 6 feet tall with calloused hands and worn boots, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who worked hard for a living, and wasn't used to fancy social situations. He thought about just driving away. It would be easier, safer, less complicated. He could go home to his empty house, eat lunch by himself, and spend the afternoon mending fences while trying not to think about the woman on the church steps. That's what most people would do, and no one would blame him for it, but something in his chest was pulling him across that street like a rope around his heart. Maybe it was the way she held herself, so defeated yet still trying to maintain some dignity. Maybe it was the fresh memory of Linda's voice reminding him that kindness was never wasted, even when it was inconvenient. Or maybe it was just the simple recognition that he had been lonely for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed. Tom turned off the engine and sat there for another minute, gathering his courage. He had been a widower for 3 years now, and in that time he had become comfortable with solitude, with the quiet routines that got him through each day without too much thinking or feeling. Reaching out to help someone would mean stepping outside that careful isolation he had built around himself. He looked across the street again and saw the woman shift slightly, as if she was in pain. That decided it for him. Whatever his own fears or hesitations, they were nothing compared to what she was going through right now. Tom got out of the truck and looked both ways before crossing the street. His boots sounded loud on the pavement, and he saw the woman tense as he approached. She looked up at him with eyes that were wary but not hostile, eyes that had seen too much trouble to trust easily but hadn't given up entirely on the possibility of human decency. Up close, he could see that she was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair that needed washing and clothes that had seen better days. But what struck him most was the careful way she held herself, as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that had made it clear she wasn't welcome. Tom stopped a few feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to give her space to run if she felt threatened. He crouched down to her level, remembering how Linda used to do the same thing when she was trying to gain the trust of a scared animal. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slow drawl. "That came from growing up in rural Texas. Looks like it might rain again today." The woman nodded slightly but didn't speak. Her eyes darted to his truck, then back to his face, trying to figure out what he wanted from her. Tom rubbed his chin, feeling the rough stubble that he hadn't bothered to shave that morning. "I'm wondering," he said carefully, "when's the last time you had something hot to eat?" He saw surprise flicker across her features, as if that wasn't the question she had been expecting. Most people, he imagined, either ignored her completely or lectured her about getting her life together. Simple kindness was probably rarer than spare change. "It's been a while," she said finally, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. Tom nodded, processing this information while trying to figure out his next move. He had started this conversation on impulse, driven by compassion rather than any kind of plan. Now he needed to decide how far he was willing to go to help a complete stranger. "I've got a ranch about 20 minutes outside of town," he said. Slowly, the words coming out before he had really thought them through. "Big old house that echoes when it's just me rattling around in it. Kitchen table that seats 4 but only feeds 1 most days." The woman was watching him intently now, trying to read his intentions in his weathered face. "I'm thinking," Tom continued, "that maybe we could help each other out. You look like you could use a warm meal and a safe place to get back on your feet, and I could use some company that isn't just cattle and horses." He paused, seeing the conflict in her eyes between desperate need and the hard-learned wariness that kept her alive on the streets. "No strings attached," he added gently. "Just one human being helping another through a rough patch. What do you say?" Maya stared at the stranger crouched in front of her, her mind racing through 1,000 possibilities and dangers. His offer hung in the air between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she could trust to hold her weight. In the 4 days she had spent on these cold stone steps, dozens of people had walked past her. Some had dropped spare change, others had offered directions to shelters that were always full. But no one had ever offered her a home. The man's eyes were kind but tired, with lines around them that spoke of someone who had seen his share of hard times. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of practical clothing that came from working with your hands rather than sitting behind a desk. Everything about him seemed genuine, but Maya had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the most important question, the one that would help her decide whether this was salvation or something much more dangerous. Tom shifted his weight, still maintaining the careful distance that showed he understood her fear. "I guess because I know what it's like to feel invisible," he said quietly. "Different reasons maybe, but the feeling's the same." Something in his voice told Maya that he wasn't just making conversation. There was real pain there, carefully controlled but unmistakable. She studied his face more closely, noting the wedding ring he still wore and the sadness that seemed to live behind his eyes. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he continued, his gaze drifting toward the church's stained glass windows. "Cancer. After she died, I felt like I was drowning in that big empty house, surrounded by all her things and all the plans we'd made that would never happen." Maya felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't a predator looking for an easy target. This was someone who understood what it meant to have your whole world collapse around you. "I'm not saying I know exactly what you're going through," Tom added quickly. "I had a roof over my head and food in the fridge. But loneliness is loneliness, and I recognize it when I see it." The wind picked up again, cutting through Maya's thin jacket and making her shiver. Tom noticed and started to shrug out of his heavy work coat, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I don't want your pity," she said, the words coming out sharper. "Then she intended?" "Good," Tom replied without missing a beat. "Because I'm not offering any. I'm offering breakfast and maybe some conversation that doesn't involve talking to cattle." Despite everything, Maya felt the corner of her mouth twitch in what might have been a smile. When was the last time someone had made her want to smile? She couldn't remember. "How do I know you're not some kind of creep?" she asked bluntly. It was a harsh question, but she had to ask it. Too many women in her situation had trusted the wrong person and paid a terrible price. Tom nodded as if he had been expecting the question. "Fair point. Tell you what, there's a diner about 2 blocks from here. Public place, lots of people around. We could start there, and if you decide I'm not trustworthy, you can walk away any time, no questions asked." Maya considered this. A public place would be safer, and she was so hungry that the thought of hot food was making her dizzy. But even accepting a meal felt like a huge risk. She had been on her own for so long that the idea of depending on anyone, even for something as simple as breakfast, terrified her. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking about how to answer. "I guess you shouldn't," he said finally. "Trust isn't something you can give to a stranger just because they ask for it. It's something that has to be earned over time." He stood up slowly, his joints creaking in a way that made Maya think he Was older than he first appeared. But maybe you could trust yourself. Trust your instincts about whether I seem like someone who wants to hurt you or someone who just wants to help. Maya looked into his eyes again, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. She had gotten good at reading people during her time on the streets. It was a survival skill that had kept her safe more than once, and everything about this man seemed to radiate a kind of gentle sadness rather than any kind of threat. "The diner," she said slowly. "What's it called?" "Ruby's place, about 6 blocks down Main Street. Red awning, can't miss it. They make the best pancakes in 3 counties, according to Linda." His voice caught slightly on his wife's name. Maya felt her stomach clench with hunger at the mention of pancakes. Real food, hot and filling, served on actual plates instead of scavenged from trash cans. It sounded almost too good to be real. "If I go with you," she said carefully, "and I decide I want to leave, you'll let me go? No arguments, no trying to convince me to stay?" "Absolutely," Tom said without hesitation. "Your choice, your decision. I'm just offering what I can offer." Maya looked around at the cold stone steps that had been her world for 4 days, at the cardboard that was falling apart beneath her and the thin jacket that couldn't keep out the wind. Then she looked back at Tom, who was standing patiently while she made up her mind, not pushing or pressuring, just waiting. "Okay," she said. Quietly, breakfast. Tom's face lit up with the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Great, my truck's right across the street." Maya gathered her few possessions, a backpack with some clothes, a water bottle, and the tattered paperback. Books she had been reading to pass the endless hours. Everything she owned in the world fit easily into one small bag. As they walked toward the truck, Maya felt every nerve in her body on high alert. She was acutely aware of how much bigger and stronger Tom was, how isolated she would be once they were alone in his vehicle. But she was also aware of how gently he had spoken to her, how he had respected her space and her fears. Tom opened the passenger door for her, another small gesture that spoke to his character. The truck was clean but lived in, with a pair of work gloves on the dashboard and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. It smelled like leather and hay and something else that Maya couldn't identify but found comforting. "Seatbelt," Tom said as he climbed into the driver's seat, and Maya realized it had been months since anyone had cared enough about her safety to remind her of something so basic. As they pulled away from the church steps, Maya caught a glimpse of herself in the side mirror. She looked small and fragile next to Tom's solid presence, like a bird with a broken wing that someone had decided to rescue. The thought scared her almost as much as it gave her hope. "The ranch you mentioned," she said as they drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. "You really live there alone?" "Just me and about 200 head of cattle," Tom replied. "Some horses, a few barn cats who think they own the place. Gets pretty quiet out there." Maya tried to imagine it. Wide open spaces, animals, the kind of peace that came from being far away from city noise and chaos. It sounded like a dream, which made her more suspicious than ever. "What's the catch?" she asked. Tom glanced over at her, and she saw understanding in his eyes. "I guess we'll both find out," he said simply, and somehow that honest answer made her feel safer than any promise could have. The drive to Tom's ranch took them through a landscape that Maya had never really noticed before, even though she had lived in Cedar Falls her whole life. Rolling hills stretched out on both sides of the 2-lane highway, dotted with oak trees that were just beginning to turn golden in the October light. Black and white cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, looking like toys scattered across a green carpet. Maya pressed her face to the passenger window, watching the scenery change from suburban neighborhoods to genuine countryside. She had spent so much of her life focused on the concrete and steel of the city that she had forgotten how big the sky could look when there weren't buildings blocking it out. "Beautiful out here," she said quietly, more to herself than to Tom. "Linda always said this was God's country," Tom replied, his hands steady on the steering wheel. "She grew up in Dallas, never saw much countryside until we moved out here. Used to spend hours just sitting on the porch, watching the sunset." Maya noticed how he talked about his wife in the present tense sometimes, as if part of him still couldn't accept that she was gone. It made her think about her own losses, though they were different kinds of grief. She had lost her stability, her sense of security, her faith in the future. He had lost the person who made his future worth planning for. "How long have you lived on the ranch?" she asked. 15 years. Bought it right after we got married, when cattle prices were good and we thought we had all the time in the world to build something together. His voice got quieter. Funny how fast plans can change. They turned off the main highway onto a gravel road that stretched ahead like a ribbon between pastures. Maya could see a cluster of buildings in the distance, including a large red barn and a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch. It looked like something from a magazine about country living, the kind of place where families gathered for Sunday dinners and children played in the yard until the streetlights came on. As they got closer, Maya could see the details that made it real rather than perfect. The paint on the barn was faded, the fence posts needed straightening, and there were several pieces of farm equipment parked in various stages of repair. It was a working ranch, not a showplace, and somehow that made it more welcoming. Tom parked the truck near the house and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was different from city quiet, filled with natural sounds that Maya had forgotten existed. Birds singing, cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through tall grass. After 4 days of listening to traffic and sirens and the constant hum of urban life, the peaceful sounds almost made her want to cry. "This is it," Tom said simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "Home." Maya climbed out of the truck slowly, still half convinced that this was all some kind of elaborate dream. The air smelled clean and fresh, with hints of hay and wildflowers and something earthy that she couldn't identify. She took a deep breath and felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "Come on," Tom said, grabbing her backpack from the truck bed. "Let me show you around." The farmhouse was bigger than it had looked from the road, with a wide front porch lined with rocking chairs and hanging baskets, full of flowers that were still blooming despite the October chill. Tom opened the front door and gestured for Maya to go ahead of him. Inside, the house felt warm and lived in, with hardwood floors that creaked comfortably underfoot and furniture that looked sturdy rather than stylish. The living room had a stone fireplace with family photos lined up on the mantel, and Maya could see quilts draped over chairs and a bookshelf stuffed with well-worn paperbacks. "Kitchen's this way," Tom said, leading her down a hallway lined with more photos. Maya caught glimpses of a younger Tom with a pretty woman who had to be Linda, both of them smiling at barbecues and birthday parties and ordinary moments that had been worth preserving. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the house, with a big wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs and windows that looked out over the pastures. Copper pots hung from hooks above a gas stove that looked like it had been cooking family meals for decades. "Coffee?" Tom asked, already moving toward the machine on the counter. "Please," Maya said, and realized it was the first time in days that someone had offered her something without expecting anything in return while Tom made coffee. Maya stood at the window and watched the cattle moving slowly across the field. There was something hypnotic about their peaceful routine, the way they seemed to have all the time in the world to do exactly what they needed to do. "That's the guest room," Tom said, pointing down another hallway. "It was our daughter's room when she was growing up, but she's got her own life now in California. 2 grandkids I only get to see on FaceTime most of the time." Maya heard the loneliness in his voice and understood why he had stopped to help her. They were both people who had been left behind by life, though in very different ways. "I should warn you," Tom continued, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. "It's been empty for a while, so it might need some fixing up. Fresh sheets, at least." Maya wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her fingers. The coffee smelled like heaven, rich and strong and real. "I'm not picky," she said, and meant it. After sleeping on stone steps, any bed would feel like luxury. Over the next few hours, Tom showed her around the property. The barn where he kept hay and equipment, the pastures where the cattle grazed, the small vegetable garden that Linda had planted and he still maintained because he couldn't bear to let it go wild. Maya found herself relaxing more with each step. drawn into the rhythm of ranch life despite her fears. What surprised her most was how naturally she seemed to fit into the routine. When Tom went to check on a horse that had been favoring one leg, Maya found herself following along, genuinely interested in the animal's condition. When he pointed out the barn cats that appeared from various hiding places, she knelt down and let them sniff her fingers, earning their cautious approval. "You're good with animals," Tom observed as a orange tabby finally allowed Maya to scratch behind his ears. "I always wanted pets when I was younger," Maya admitted. "But we moved around too much, and then when I got my own place I could barely afford to feed myself, let alone a cat." Tom nodded understanding. "These guys earn their keep catching mice, but they're good company too. Better listeners than most people." As the afternoon wore on, Maya began to believe that this wasn't some elaborate trick or trap. Tom asked nothing from her except occasional conversation, and even that felt natural rather than forced. He made lunch for both of them without making it seem like charity. Just two people sharing a meal like it was the most normal thing in the world, but the most remarkable thing was how the house seemed to come alive with another person in it. Maya noticed how Tom's shoulders relaxed as the day went on, how his smile came easier, how he moved through the rooms with more energy than he probably had in months. "I forgot how quiet it gets out here with just one person," he admitted as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the pastures. Not bad quiet, just empty quiet. Maya understood exactly what he meant. They were helping each other just by being present, filling up the empty spaces in each other's lives without even trying. As darkness fell and Tom showed her to the guest room with its clean sheets and warm quilt, Maya realized that for the first time in months, she felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Tomorrow would bring new questions and decisions, but tonight she had a real bed and a roof over her head, and the knowledge that someone in this world actually cared whether she was okay. It was more than she had dared to hope for just 12 hours ago. 3 months had passed since that cold October morning when Tom first saw Maya sitting on the church steps. Now, as she stood in that exact same spot, everything felt different. The stone steps that had once been her bed were now just steps. Again, leading up to a building that had become something entirely new in her life. Maya adjusted the stack of foam containers in her arms, each one filled with hot soup and sandwiches that she and Tom had spent the morning preparing. Behind her, Tom carried a folding table and chairs, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had found his purpose again. They had been doing this every Saturday for the past month, turning the church steps into a place of hope instead of desperation. "Looks like we've got company already," Tom said, nodding toward a young man who was sitting exactly where Maya used to sit, hunched over with that same defeated posture she remembered so well. Maya's heart clenched with recognition. She knew. That look, that careful way of trying to be invisible while hoping someone might actually see you. 3 months ago, that had been her, and if not for Tom's kindness, it still would be. "Let's set up over here," she said, indicating a spot near the steps but not too close to the young man. She had learned that approaching too directly could frighten people away. Better to let them come to you when they were ready. As they arranged the table and unpacked the food, Maya reflected on how much her life had changed. The guest room at Tom's ranch had become her sanctuary, filled now with books from the library and clothes that actually fit her properly. She had a job at the veterinary clinic in town, working with Dr. Peterson, who had been amazed by her natural ability with frightened animals. "I think it's because you understand what it's like to be scared," Dr. Peterson had said when Maya successfully calmed an injured dog that had been snapping at everyone else. Animals can sense that kind of empathy. Maya had never thought of her experiences on the street as valuable before, but working at the clinic had shown her that surviving difficult times had given her skills she never knew she possessed. She could read the signs of fear and pain in animals the same way she had learned to read danger in people during her homeless days. The work was rewarding in ways that surprised her. Each animal she helped felt like a small victory, a reminder that broken things could be healed with patience and care. Dr. Peterson had even started talking about helping her get certified as a veterinary technician, a future that Maya had never dared to imagine for herself. But perhaps the biggest change was in Tom himself. The man who had been quietly dying of loneliness had come back to life over the past 3 months. He sang while doing chores around the ranch, told stories about Linda with laughter instead of just sadness, and had even started talking about expanding the cattle operation. You know what Linda would say about all this? He had asked Maya just last week as they watched a magnificent sunset from the porch. What? Maya had replied, though she was beginning to know Linda through Tom's stories almost as well as if she had met her herself. She'd say that helping people wasn't something you did when you had extra time or money. She'd say it was something you did because that's what people are supposed to do for each other. Now, as Maya ladled soup into bowls for the small crowd that had gathered, she understood what Linda had meant. This wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It was community, the recognition that everyone was just a few bad breaks away from needing help themselves. "Excuse me," a soft voice said behind her. Maya turned to see a middle-aged woman holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "Are you the people who serve food here on Saturdays?" "We are," Maya said warmly. "Are you hungry?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "We've been staying in our car for 2 weeks. I lost my job, and we got evicted, and I just don't know what to do anymore." Maya felt Tom appear beside her, and together they guided the woman and her daughter to the table. The little girl's eyes went wide at the sight of all the food, and Maya had to blink back her own tears, remembering what it felt like to be that hungry and that young and that scared. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Maya asked the little girl as she prepared a bowl of soup and a sandwich. "Amy," the girl whispered, staying close to her mother. "That's a beautiful name," Maya said. "I bet you're taking good care of your mom, aren't you?" Amy nodded solemnly, and Maya recognized the too serious expression of a child who had been forced to grow up too fast. She made sure to give Amy an extra cookie and a juice box, small comforts that might help her feel like a kid again, even. For a few minutes, while the mother and daughter ate, Maya and Tom quietly discussed what else they could do to help. They had learned the locations of every shelter, every food bank, every social service organization in 3 counties. More importantly, they had learned that sometimes the most valuable thing they could offer was simply treating people with dignity and respect. "There's a job opening at the grocery store," Tom mentioned to Amy's mother. "My friend manages the place, and he's looking for someone reliable. If you're interested, I could put in a word." The woman looked up from her soup with hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since they had met her. "You would do that? For a stranger?" "You're not a stranger," Maya said gently. "You're someone who needs help, and we're people who want to help. That makes us neighbors." As the afternoon wore on, more people appeared. Some were regulars now, people who came every week, not just for the food, but for the conversation and the sense of belonging. Others were new faces, people who had heard about the free meals through the invisible network that connected those who lived on society's margins. Maya moved through the small crowd, refilling bowls and listening to stories. There was Michael, a veteran who had been sleeping in his truck since losing his apartment. Janet, an elderly woman whose Social Security check didn't stretch far enough to cover both rent and groceries. David, a teenager who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go and no family to help him transition to adult life. Each person had a story, and Maya had learned that listening was often more important than the food they served. People who had been ignored and dismissed for so long desperately needed someone to acknowledge their humanity, to see them as individuals rather than problems to be solved or eyesores to be removed. "You know," Tom said, as they packed up the remaining supplies at the end of the day, "I think we're going to need a bigger table next week." Maya smiled, looking around at the empty containers and the satisfied faces of the people they had served. "Linda would be proud of what you're doing here," she said. "What we're doing," Tom corrected gently. "And you're right, she would be. She always said that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to love the people who are still here." As they loaded the truck and prepared to head home to the ranch, Maya caught sight of the young man who had been sitting on the steps when they arrived. He was walking away now, but he had a container of soup in his hands and a business card, with information about job placement services. "Same time next week?" Tom asked as they climbed into the truck. "Wouldn't miss it," Maya replied. Settling into the passenger seat that had become as familiar as her own reflection, the drive back to the ranch was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who had found their purpose together. They had both been rescued from their own forms of loneliness, and now they were using that experience to create a lifeline for others. As they pulled into the driveway and saw the warm lights of home waiting for them, Maya realized that this was what healing looked like. Not a complete erasure of past pain, but a transformation of that pain into something useful, something that could help others find their way from darkness into light. The church steps would always be special to her, but they were no longer a place of desperation. They had become a place where hope was served one bowl of soup at a time, where strangers became neighbors, and where two broken people had learned to build something beautiful together.